In a typical case of while evaluating nerve injuries, there are certain issues. Among the issues, the important one is what are the types of brachial plexus injury and what is the overall incidence. Here is a case where there is atrophy of the subscapularis, the supraspinatus, and the infraspinatus, and there is stretch of some of the nerves here. They are very thin at places, a condition called as neuropraxia. Now, when we analyze this case a little bit further, we would find that these nerves are not as vividly seen or as of thickness on the opposite side, and they are much thinner on the side of the lesion. The brachial plexus injuries requires us, while analyzing the coronal images, to number the individual vertebra from C2 downwards. So it's easy to correlate quickly on which is the roots, C5 roots, 6, 7, and so on, and similarly the formation of the trunks and the divisions. But in general, supraclavicular injuries are much commoner than the infraclavicular injuries, and among them, the upper trunk injury is more commoner and a complete level injury is also equally common, and ruptures, proximal ruptures are commoner than avulsions. This difference between rupture and avulsion is something which I shall tell shortly in the next few slides. Clinically, the referring surgeon would come and ask, is it upper or is it lower? Though he's got information from the clinical evaluation. But do we as radiologists know what exactly, how upper occurs and how lower occurs? Upper occurs when the patient falls down like this, when there is a stretch and avulsion and rupture of the upper roots caused by head and neck turning away from the ipsilateral shoulder due to sudden impact. Lower brachial plexus injuries, where there is avulsion, stretch, rupture of the lower roots and the trunks, occurs when there is a traction, as shown in this particular diagram. Some surgeons would like to know specific information on pre and post ganglionic lesions prior to operative repair. And at that place, what post-processing technique do we do? Because this particular area to show on a coronal image requires a little bit of post-processing. This case, we will analyze these two issues. Now here's a case where there was a traumatic plexopathy, and we can see that there's an abrupt cutoff at the region of this trunk involving the C5. And on the evaluation of the shoulders, girdle muscles, one finds that in comparison to the opposite side, there is atrophy of the subscapularis and the infraspinatus and the supraspinatus. Brachial plexus injuries are also, besides upper and lower, is also characterized as in categories of preganglionic and postganglionic lesions. Preganglionic is in relation to the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion is out here, and anything before that, as it starts from the cord, is called preganglionic, and at the root, the term avulsion is used. And when one goes beyond the ganglion towards that is the rest of the upper limb, the term avulsion is usually not used, and the term is replaced by rupture. So rupture is something which is beyond the ganglion, and avulsion is more towards the neural foramen, towards the spinal cord, and before the ganglion. This is one important point which the surgeons would like to know. And that is the point which is demonstrated in this particular slide of avulsion of the roots, stretch and rupture in the postganglionic portion of any given segment, either 5, C6, C7, etc. The importance for the surgeon is these two slides. A preganglionic injury has little potential for recovery. The treatment is nerve transfer. What happens is the donor nerves are attached to the ruptured distal stump. The aim of these injuries treatment is to get good biceps function and shoulder function. Variety of nerves have been, as listed, have been tried for nerve transfers with a good success. In comparison, postganglionic lesions have better potential for spontaneous recovery, though there are very few cases. They are amenable to repair the prognosis is a little bit better. Instead of nerve transfer, nerve grafting is done, as shown in this diagram. And the nerves, a list of nerves are there, which depending on the surgeon, he would use it. So this is one important point which the surgeon would like to know. Post-processing is of two types, slab MIPS, curved MPRs. Slab MIP is very easy, and you just take the coronal, about 10 of those, 15 of those slices, and load it onto the 3D card, and then you would get all the individual slices fused and you would get dramatic images. It's easier, but there's a problem of blood vessels interfering. A curved MPR, as shown on the right side, is a little bit tougher, and one has to look carefully at the axials and plan the whole, to derive a very oblique curved MPR image. Now let us analyze a little bit on pseudomeningocele. What are the points in interpretation? There is something called Nagano's classification which comes up occasionally. If the referring surgeon is a little bit experienced, he would come and ask what is in relation to Nagano's classification. Pseudomeningocele occurs very near the spinal cord and the roots. So it means that there is a major injury going on. But we must analyze this a little bit more. It's a valuable sign, although not pathognomic for preganglionic lesion. Nerve root avulsions can occur without pseudomeningocele. Pseudomeningocele can exist without nerve root avulsions. So you got two extreme positions. But the common link is, if there is an absence of roots, that's a very important sign. And how does one determine that? It's determined by meticulous evaluation of the axials. From the spinal cord, there should be two, roots getting out. If this 2, that is 4 in 2 pairs, is not clearly seen at a given level, especially in relation to a pseudomeningocele, we assume that there is a avulsion at that particular root. So this is something which one has to analyze. Nagano's classification is basically a CT myelo classification, and there are certain categories. Amongst them, the A2, A3, D and M types are there, which signify preganglionic. This was very popular during the CT myelo days, but now it has come slightly off the radar. But when evaluation in myelo during analysis of brachial plexus, this can be applied because it just matches whatever was happening in CT myelo. So these are the examples, and when there are multiple pseudomeningoceles, one has to evaluate that much more meticulously so that useful information on the roots is given. Sometimes patients, like in this particular case, presenting with nerve injuries, while performing a scan, one can use liberally the oblique scans, and let us see how we can plan an oblique scan. Like in this particular case, there were 2 pseudomeningoceles. We were not seeing the roots and the trunks very clearly at that particular area, and so we had to resort to an oblique coronal, and that is the starting point is a true coronal. You get a base image. From there, you go along the long axis of that derived true coronal divide image, and you get an entire course up to almost covering all the components of the brachial plexus. And here is one such image which shows of this particular patient more clearly the anatomy of the entire brachial plexus of 5 and 6. Sometimes brachial plexus comes as an indirect referral. A seizure in a male. These are the various findings: cystic metastasis, multiple of lesions, including adrenal metastasis. And then while evaluation of the chest, we get into the superior sulcus, and here's a typical case of Pancoast. And as we've seen earlier in the presentation, Pancoast is closely related to the trunks, and therefore we would assume that the lower trunks are infiltrated by this lesion. And as an academic exercise, one can look for Horner syndrome and also find out whether it's adenocarcinoma, because 2/3 of them are adenocarcinoma. In neurofibroma, which is another rare but it can happen condition at the brachial plexus, there are some operative issues. Like in this particular case, which was neurofibroma with a malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumor. Here's a lesion in the right brachial plexus metastasizing to the lungs, and the issue usually which comes up from the surgeon's side is it schwannoma, is it neurofibroma? because what they want to know is how easy it is to do the operation. Neurofibromas infiltrate and are not encapsulated, and it's very difficult to remove. That is bad news for the surgeons. But if it's a schwannoma, there is easier to remove, and the prognosis is slightly better, as shown in this particular image. Lymph nodes and compression, once in a while you get cases of lymphomas, and by the sheer cellularity of the lesions, they press on the brachial plexus, like in this young girl who had multiple lymphomatous deposits in the neck. The sheer weight of it was pressing on the the brachial plexus, causing pain in both upper limbs. And these, mind you, after treatment can sometimes reverse, and there is some sort of a reversible plexopathy type of presentation. Unusual masses comes up in practice: congenital cysts, fibrolipoma, presence of fat in a young child, which is pressing as well as embedding itself inside the brachial plexus, soft tissue sarcoma with meds pressing from the undersurface of the brachial plexus, carcinoma parotid, mucoepidermoid carcinoma. There are so many of these lesions which come up. Acute viral infections can cause brachial plexopathy, especially now when we are having this dengue all over the country. Here's a case where there was pain in the right upper hand, like part of the body ache, entire syndrome, there's inability to move, and this was one such case which we encountered. Radiation is another area of brachial plexus because of the plexopathy. The issue is which cancers, what dosage is safe, which will not cause brachial plexopathy. So here's a patient with a head and neck cancer which was metastasizing, having radiation that is effects into the brachial plexus with some amount of fibrosis of the upper lung, and most of these are delayed radiation injury, and the value is 6,000 centigrade. Which tumors? Radiotherapy for tonsils, tongue, nasal cavity, nasopharynx, supraglottic carcinoma, unknown primary, etc. are the cases which are incriminated. Finally, we come to cervical rib. Why the symptoms in cervical rib? Why brachial plexus in cervical rib? So here's a typical case of cervical rib on the left hand side, and one looks very closely at the lower right. One finds a cervical rib, and the brachial plexus is indented and goes in its course towards the left upper. And what Netter drew in 1930s and 20s is what today we are getting in the Singo platform, and that is something which we are now able to see by imaging. New sequences, CIS, etc. are very good for the nerve roots, and one can apply in particular the pseudomeningocele and Nagano classification and various aspects of analysis of the at each of the roots. There is something called neurography using diffusion is coming in a very big way. The whole body neurography, a lot of studies are being conducted, and the advantages, the entire human body's nerves are analyzed with a little bit of conspicuity and a long trajectory of the nerves. But I think they should be taken in correlation with the slab MIPS, because slab MIPS gives very good anatomical details, and along with, I mean, if you combine both the images, then there is a meaningful analysis. So in summary, all planes are important in brachial plexus. Fat suppression is very useful. Post-processing with slab MIPS is something which is very, very rewarding. There are two entities which comes up in practice: traumatic and non-traumatic. In traumatic, the issues are upper or lower, pre or post, avulsion or rupture, single or multiple level, partial or total. If you answer all these questions in a given case, I think it's the whole job is done. Thank you.